My name is Jennifer. When my wealthy new neighbor decided he was above the law and took something priceless for my land, he expected me to cry, scream, or accept his condescending attempt to buy my silence. He saw a quiet, grieving widow. What he didn't know was that 35 years working inside the county court system taught me one thing: the loudest men always walk straight into the quietest traps. He went back to celebrating his victory, completely unaware that a single mistake he made that afternoon was about to turn his entire life upside down. If you appreciate stories of calm, calculated justice, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? And what time is it on your clock right now? Let's get into it. 30 years ago, when my late husband David and I paid off our last mortgage installment, we did not pop expensive champagne or go on a wild vacation. Instead, we drove down to a local nursery, bought a young white oak sapling, and planted it right in the middle of our backyard. David wiped the dirt from his working hands, looked at the slender green stem sticking out of the ground, and said, "Jennifer, as long as this tree stands, this home belongs to us. No bank, no landlord, and no fast-talking salesman can ever take what we built here." David passed away 7 years ago, but his words remained rooted in every single inch of this property. Today, I live alone in this quiet suburban neighborhood, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. My house is fully paid off, my garden is pristine, and that little sapling from decades ago is now a massive white oak that dominates the landscape. It stands nearly 60 feet tall, its canopy spreading wide enough to shade half the lawn during hot summer afternoons. To an outsider, it might look like a huge pile of timber and leaves that drops acorns every autumn. But to me, that tree is the physical anchor of my entire adult life. It watched David and me build our marriage from scratch. It shaded our children's birthday parties, held a tire swing for our grandchildren, and stood firm through every winter storm and hurricane that swept through our town. When David died after a long battle with illness, sitting on the back patio under the shade of that oak was the only place where I could collect my thoughts and find real peace. I am 62 years old, and I value 3 simple things above all else: my independence, my privacy, and the quiet satisfaction that comes with owning every square foot of the dirt under my boots. I am not the type of woman who looks for trouble, nor do I waste time crying over the past. I spent 35 years working as a senior administrative supervisor for the county court system, so I know exactly how the real world operates. Rules exist for a reason, property lines are absolute, and self-respect is something you never compromise on. Over the decades, the surrounding neighborhood slowly shifted around me. Old friends moved away to retirement communities in Florida, younger families bought up the surrounding lots, and the original modest ranch homes were gradually renovated or torn down. Yet my property remained a solid fortress of stability. Every morning, I brew my black coffee, walk out onto the back deck, and look up at that white oak. It is a living monument to 40 years of honest labor, personal sacrifices, and a deep love that outlived the man who planted it. I never expected my quiet life to be disrupted. I had survived tough economic downturns, family losses, and the slow march of time. My home was secure, and that tree was its permanent guard tower. But as I stood under its thick branches one crisp Tuesday morning, sipping my coffee, I noticed heavy construction equipment rolling down our peaceful street. A large for sale sign on the lot directly next door had just been replaced with a bright red banner that read "Sold." I did not know it yet, but the peaceful chapter of my retirement was about to come to a sudden, jarring end. A new neighbor was moving in, and he represented a completely different world, one that believed everything had a price tag, and that an older woman living alone was simply an obstacle waiting to be cleared away. The house next door sat vacant for only 2 weeks before Greg moved in. He was in his mid-30s, drove a matte black luxury SUV, and wore the unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Within days of closing on the property, he brought in contractors who worked nonstop. They ripped out the existing garden, knocked down the patio, and built a massive elevated second-story deck along with an in-ground pool right up near the property line. I watched from my kitchen window, choosing to mind my own business. In my experience, people like Greg usually kept to themselves once construction finished. But 2 weeks later, while I was trimming my rose bushes, I heard heavy footsteps approaching the fence line. "Excuse me," a sharp voice called out. I turned to see Greg leaning against the wooden barrier, wearing expensive sunglasses and a polo shirt. He offered no neighborly greeting, pointing directly toward the soaring branches of my white oak. "We need to talk about this tree," he said, skipping any pretense of politeness. "It's becoming a major problem for my property." I set down my shears and walked over to the fence. "Good morning. Is there a problem?" "Yeah, there is," he replied, taking off his glasses. "Your oak tree is completely blocking the morning sunlight from my second-story balcony. On top of that, leaves are falling straight into my brand-new heated pool. I'm spending hundreds of dollars a month just to keep the filters clean." "It's autumn, Greg," I said calmly. "Trees shed leaves. It's part of living in a neighborhood with mature greenery." He let out a scoffing laugh. "I didn't buy a $2 million house to look at leaves in my pool or sit in the shade during breakfast. I called a tree removal service yesterday. They can come out this Friday and take it down. I'll even split the cost with you 50-50 as a courtesy." I stared at him, processing his unbelievable arrogance. He had moved next door to a 50-year-old tree and expected the environment to bend to his wishes. "Greg," I said, keeping my voice completely even, "that tree is on my property. It is healthy, sturdy, and was planted by my late husband 5 decades ago. I am not cutting it down, nor am I allowing anyone to prune it." His smug expression hardened into annoyance. "Look, Jennifer, let's be practical. It's just an old tree. It's probably a liability anyway. If a storm hits, those big branches could damage my pool deck. You're living here alone. You don't need the hassle of maintaining it. I'm offering a fair deal." "It is not a liability," I replied, standing my ground without raising my voice. "My tree has survived Category 3 hurricanes without losing a limb. The answer is no. Do not contact a tree service, and do not step onto my land." Greg shook his head, looking down at me as if I were a stubborn child. "You're being unreasonable. In the real world, neighbors protect property values. That tree cuts into my home's appeal, and I'm not letting a pile of wood stand in the way of my investment." "The discussion is over," I said firmly, turning back toward my roses. "Have a good afternoon." "This isn't over, Jennifer," he called out, his tone cold and dismissive. "One way or another, that view is getting cleared." I walked back into my house and locked the door. I knew Greg was used to pushing people around until he got his way, but he had fundamentally misread who he was dealing with. I had spent 35 years enforcing rules in the court system, and I knew where the legal boundaries lay. If Greg wanted to fight over property lines, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. The following weekend, I took a long-planned trip to Raleigh to visit my daughter and 6-year-old granddaughter. I left early Friday morning, expecting to return Sunday afternoon. Before leaving, I glanced at the towering white oak in my yard, completely unaware it was the last time I would ever see it standing. I spent 2 quiet days with family, completely disconnecting from the annoying tension Greg had brought into my neighborhood. When I pulled into my driveway on Sunday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, the quiet atmosphere of my street was shattered by the harsh, roaring idle of a heavy wood chipper. A large commercial truck was parked near the curb, and 2 men were tossing large branches into the grinder. My stomach dropped into a cold, hollow knot. I cut the car engine, stepped out into the air, and walked briskly toward my backyard. The view that met me made my breath catch in my chest. My 50-year-old white oak was gone. Where a majestic tree had stood for half a century, shading my home and holding decades of memories with my late husband David, there was now only a giant, jagged stump, surrounded by piles of fresh sawdust. Decades of history had been brutally slaughtered in a single afternoon. Greg stood leaning over the low wooden fence dividing our yards, holding a cool drink with a smug, relaxed posture. He watched me approach without a single trace of remorse in his eyes. The hired tree surface crew finished packing their heavy equipment and drove away down the street, as if they had just completed a routine lawn mowing job. "Welcome back, Jennifer," Greg said smoothly, resting his elbows on the fence top. He did not even bother to look down at the destruction. "I tried telling you nicely last week, but you just wouldn't listen to reason. Sometimes an executive decision has to be made for the good of the neighborhood." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly at my sides. My heart was pounding with fury, but my face remained completely motionless. I did not yell or shed a single tear in front of him. In my 35 years working in the county court system, I saw countless men mistake silence for weakness. I knew that losing control would give him satisfaction, and I refused to hand him that victory. Greg pulled a crisp white paper envelope out of his back pocket and casually tossed it over the fence. It landed right in the thick sawdust near my shoes. "There's $500 in cash in that envelope," he said casually, taking a slow sip from his glass. "That's more than enough to pay a local crew to haul away the stump. That eyesore was ruining my view from the balcony, and now my pool stays clean. Consider the extra cash a gift for your trouble. We can both move on now." I looked down at the envelope, then looked straight into Greg's eyes. He genuinely believed $500 bills could erase 50 years of life, disrespect my late husband's memory, and settle a blatant violation of my private property lines. He thought he was dealing with a frail, helpless older woman who would accept defeat without a fight. "Is there anything else you want to say, Jennifer?" he asked, chuckling slightly, as if waiting for me to explode in anger. "No, Greg," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and quiet. "You have said everything that needs to be said." I bent down, picked up the white envelope without opening it, and held it firmly in my hand. I did not throw it back at him. I did not scream at him to leave. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked toward my back porch, leaving Greg standing by the fence with his self-satisfied smile. He thought he had won. He had no idea that he had just signed the warrant for his own financial destruction. I stepped inside my house, locked the back door behind me, and set the white envelope on my dining room table. My hands were completely steady. During my 35 years working in the county court clerk's office, I watched hundreds of angry people lose solid legal cases simply because they let their emotions overpower their judgment. Yelling at Greg, throwing his money back, or calling the local police for a civil dispute would have accomplished nothing. Police officers rarely settle property boundary arguments on the spot. They call it a civil matter and drive away. So I needed cold, hard, indisputable evidence, and I needed it immediately. I opened the envelope, counted the 5 crisp $100 bills, and slipped them into a clear plastic storage bag, along with a written note stating the exact date and time Greg had handed it to me. That cash was not a settlement. It was physical evidence of his illegal action. Next, I walked down the hall to my home office, opened my file cabinet, and retrieved my home's original property deed, along with photo albums containing decades of family memories. I carefully selected 10 clear photographs showing the white oak over the past 40 years, from a small sapling planted by David to a massive, thriving giant standing firmly inside my property line. At 8:30 sharp the following Monday morning, I made my first phone call. I reached out to a licensed land surveyor I knew through my court work, a man named Marcus who had provided expert testimony in boundary disputes for over 20 years. "Jennifer, good morning," Marcus answered warmly. "How can I help you today?" "Marcus, I have an urgent property boundary dispute," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "My new neighbor illegally hired a crew to cut down a 50-year-old tree on my land while I was away. I need an official, state-certified property line survey completed immediately." Marcus groaned over the line. "People never learn. I can have my crew at your place by tomorrow morning at 8. We'll mark the exact boundary lines with high-visibility stakes and deliver a certified survey." "Thank you, Marcus. Bill me directly." Before hanging up, I placed my second call to a certified consulting arborist who specialized in timber valuation and legal property disputes. "Mr. Henderson," I said when he answered, "I need an emergency appraisal for illegal timber trespass. A mature 60-foot white oak was cut down on my property without permission. The stump and root structure are completely intact." "I can be there tomorrow afternoon at 1, he replied firmly. "Do not clean up any sawdust, remove debris, or touch the stump until I finish my measurements and soil analysis." "Understood," I said. "I will see you tomorrow." By Tuesday afternoon, both professionals had completed their work. Marcus's surveying crew drove bright orange stakes along my boundary line, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the tree's trunk sat entirely within my property line, nearly 3 feet inside my property line. Greg had committed blatant property trespass and willful destruction of my private asset. Meanwhile, the certified arborist spent 2 full hours measuring the stump, analyzing root health, and examining historical canopy photographs. Before leaving, he handed me his preliminary report with a grim, serious expression. "Jennifer," he said, shaking his head slowly, "your neighbor made a catastrophic mistake. He didn't just trim branches. He destroyed a prime, mature specimen in peak health. Replacing a tree of that scale carries a massive financial price tag." "Give me the official appraisal report as soon as it's signed," I replied calmly. I stood by my kitchen window, holding the surveyor's official boundary map. Outside, Greg stood on his elevated balcony, sipping a cold drink and admiring his new clear view, completely oblivious to the bright orange stakes marking his boundary violation. He thought his $500 had bought my silence. He had no idea that every second he spent celebrating was bringing him closer to total financial ruin. On Thursday morning, the official physical reports arrived in my mailbox via certified mail. I laid them out side by side on my dining room table next to my coffee mug. The certified survey map from Marcus left zero room for legal interpretation. The entire trunk of the white oak, along with its primary root structure, sat 3 feet entirely within my property boundaries. Greg's hired contractors had stepped onto my land without permission, committed illegal trespass, and destroyed private property. The second document was the 30-page formal appraisal from Mr. Henderson, the certified arborist. He had utilized the trunk formula method, the gold standard recognized by state courts, to calculate the true monetary value of mature, non-replaceable trees. Taking into account the trunk diameter, species, health, location, and structural integrity, he assessed the total replacement cost of my 50-year-old white oak at $36,000. That figure alone was substantial, but under state property law, specifically the statutes governing timber trespass and willful destruction, the financial consequences were far worse for Greg. When a party intentionally cuts down a tree on another person's land without consent, the court automatically applies treble damages. That meant the statutory compensation multiplied by 3, bringing the base property damages alone to $108,000. I did not waste a single second. So I gathered the arborist's report, the survey maps, the photo timeline of the tree, and the clear plastic bag containing Greg's $500 in cash. I drove straight downtown to the law firm of Robert Vance, a veteran civil litigator I had known for over 2 decades during my career at the county court clerk's office. Robert reviewed the pile of evidence on his desk, slowly shaking his head in total disbelief. "Jennifer," Robert said, pulling off his reading glasses, "this young man didn't just cross the line. He walked straight into a legal minefield. He gave you a rock-solid civil case on a silver platter. He committed intentional timber trespass, property conversion, and malicious destruction of private assets. On top of that, handing you cash was an explicit admission of responsibility." "I don't want a long, drawn-out negotiation, Robert," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I want to file a formal civil lawsuit immediately. I want the maximum statutory treble damages, full reimbursement for legal fees, court costs, and an official judgment against his property." Robert leaned back in his chair, a sharp grin appearing on his face. If he tries to fight this in court, his defense will crumble in 5 minutes. Between the treble damages, expert witness fees, and our legal charges, he's looking at well over $120,000 in total liabilities. "Draft the complaint," I said firmly. "Attach Marcus's survey and Henderson's appraisal as primary evidence. Include the copy of his $500 cash envelope as Exhibit A." "I'll have it filed with the county clerk by this afternoon," Robert nodded, and I'll instruct a certified process server to deliver the summons directly into his hands. I left Robert's office feeling a quiet, ironclad sense of satisfaction. Greg assumed he was playing a cheap game of suburban intimidation, expecting an older woman living alone to back down or accept his cash. He had no idea that I understood the full weight of property law, nor did he realize that his unearned arrogance had walked him straight into a six-figure legal trap. Back home, I watched through my kitchen window as Greg hosted a gathering on his elevated deck, pointing triumphantly at his cleared view. He felt completely victorious, but the legal machinery was already moving, and his brief victory was about to cost him dearly. On Saturday afternoon, Greg hosted a loud backyard barbecue to show off his new pool deck and cleared view. Upbeat music echoed down the street, and about a dozen guests laughed and drank by his patio. From my living room window, I watched the party unfold with complete composure. I knew what was coming. Around 3 o'clock, a gray sedan parked at the curb in front of Greg's house. A tall, middle-aged man carrying a thick blue folder stepped out, walked up the driveway, and made his way toward the backyard. It was the certified process server hired by Robert Vance's legal office. The process server approached the deck, stepped around the swimming pool, and stopped right in front of Greg, who was holding a drink and chatting with a group of friends. "Are you Greg Vance?" the man asked loudly enough to cut through the background music. "Yeah, that's me," Greg replied casually, barely looking at him. "If you're selling something, I'm busy." "You've been officially served," the process server said clearly, handing the blue folder directly into Greg's hands. "Notice of civil lawsuit in county court." The music on the patio suddenly stopped as one of Greg's guests turned down the speakers. Curious eyes watched as Greg unsealed the envelope and pulled out the legal filing. I could see the exact moment his confident expression melted away. As his eyes scanned the first page, his face flushed dark red. The document spelled out the charges in stark, uncompromising legal terms: intentional timber trespass, property destruction, and property line violation. Attached were Marcus's land survey map with bright red boundary markers, Mr. Henderson's official $36,000 tree valuation, and the explicit calculation demanding $108,000 in statutory treble damages, plus legal fees. Greg stared at the figures, his mouth slightly open in total shock. His guests whispered among themselves as he flipped frantically through the pages, realizing his $500 cash gesture was attached as Exhibit A as proof of premeditated trespass. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard heavy, furious footsteps pounding across my front porch, followed by a loud, aggressive pounding on my front door. "Jennifer, open this damn door right now," Greg shouted, his voice shaking with pure rage. I walked calmly to the foyer, unlocked the door, and opened it just enough to look him in the eyes. I stood erect, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. Greg was trembling, clutching the legal documents in his hand, his knuckles white. "Are you insane?" he spat out, pointing a finger at my face. $120,000 for a damn tree? You think a court is going to let you extort me like this? You're out of your mind, old woman. I did not flinch, step back, or raise my voice. I looked directly into his furious eyes with unyielding calm. "You walked onto my property, destroyed a 50-year-old tree my husband planted, and thought $500 bought your way out," I said, my tone as cold and steady as ice. "That document in your hand isn't extortion, Greg. It's the law." "I'm not paying you a single dime," he yelled, his face turning pale. "I'll hire the best lawyers in the city. I'll drag this out until you spend every penny you have." "You are welcome to try," I replied smoothly. "However, my attorney, Robert Vance, will handle all future communications. Do not step onto my porch again, or I will have the county sheriff cite you for criminal trespassing." Before he could utter another word, I stepped back and closed the door firmly in his face. I turned the lock with a sharp click. Through the window, I watched him stand on my porch for a long, helpless moment, staring at the closed door, before stomping back towards his house, completely defeated in front of all his party guests. 2 weeks after the summons was served, the reality of American property law hit Greg like a freight train. He had hired a high-priced corporate defense attorney from downtown Charlotte, expecting a quick way to dismiss the case. But his lawyer took one look at the certified land survey, Mr. Henderson's tree valuation, and the explicit statutory treble damage clause, and handed Greg a brutal reality check. Under state law, there was zero legal defense for cutting down a healthy tree on someone else's land. If Greg went to trial, he would lose, guaranteed, face additional court penalties, and risk a forced lien against his $2 million property. My attorney, Robert Vance, called me on a quiet Thursday morning. "Jennifer, Greg's lawyer just called," Robert said, his tone carrying a quiet, professional satisfaction. "They are begging to settle out of court." His attorney admitted off the record that Greg made a catastrophic error. They are offering a certified check for $115,000 to drop all further legal action. "Tell them $118,000, I replied without hesitation. "That covers the full treble damages, the arborist fees, the survey costs, and your legal fees. He pays every penny or we go before a judge on Monday." Less than 24 hours later, Greg accepted the terms. He signed the formal settlement agreement, and a certified cashier's check for $118,000 was delivered directly to Robert's office. The very next morning, I hired a professional landscaping crew. They ground down the old stump, enriched the soil with fresh nutrients, and brought in a healthy 6-foot white oak sapling. I stood in my yard as the crew carefully planted the young tree in the exact same spot where its predecessor had stood for half a century. From his elevated second-story deck, Greg watched in stunned, helpless silence. He had spent $118,000 out of his own pocket, ruined his reputation in the neighborhood, and humiliated himself in front of his friends, only to end up staring at a brand-new white oak planted right back in his line of sight. Every single time he stepped out onto his balcony to look at his pool, he would be reminded of his own arrogance and the exact price it cost him. With the remaining funds, over $95,000 after covering my legal expenses and the planting costs, I drove downtown to the municipal city offices. I met with the director of the local park and land conservation foundation and signed the paperwork to establish a permanent endowment, the David Miller Memorial Urban Canopy Fund. The money was dedicated exclusively to planting and protecting mature trees throughout public parks across our county. A week later, the city installed a small, elegant brass plaque on a stone bench at the local park, where David and I used to walk every weekend. It read, "In memory of David Miller. Roots run deep, and honor stands firm." On Sunday morning, I made my usual pot of black coffee, walked out onto my back porch, and sat down in my favorite wooden rocking chair. The autumn breeze blew softly across the lawn, rustling the green leaves of the new white oak sapling. Next door, Greg's backyard was completely quiet, his luxury blinds pulled shut tight. I raised my coffee cup toward the young tree and smiled quietly to Principal. I didn't need to shout, drop to his level, or lose my dignity. I played the long game, held the line, and protected what belonged to me. Justice was served, David's memory was honored, and my home was peaceful once again.